Hey, quick note before we start. This video is for education and entertainment, and it's built on a genuinely alarming stack of research. Alright, let's dig. Around 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra, in what is now Indonesia, the ground tore open and the planet had one of the worst days in its entire history. A volcano called Toba erupted. And I don't mean the kind of eruption you're picturing. This was a supervolcano, and when it went off, it may have come terrifyingly close to ending the human story before it really got going. But before we get to how close, let's talk about the scale of this thing, because the numbers are almost impossible to hold in your head. When Toba erupted, it ejected something on the order of 2,800 cubic kilometres of material. Toba produced somewhere close to 3,000 times that. Krakatoa, the 1883 eruption so loud it was heard thousands of miles away and is considered one of the most violent events in recorded history, was still a firecracker next to Toba. We have never, in all of recorded human civilization, witnessed anything remotely close to what happened on that island. The eruption blasted ash across an enormous stretch of the world. We find Toba ash layers in India, thousands of kilometres away, sometimes metres thick. It settled over the Indian Ocean, over the Arabian Sea, across South Asia. Imagine a grey blanket of powdered glass falling out of the sky and covering an entire subcontinent. That's not a metaphor. Volcanic ash is essentially tiny particles of glass, and it does not care about your lungs, your crops, or your water. Now here's where it gets genuinely apocalyptic. A blast that big doesn't just cause local damage, it changes the whole planet's climate. Toba launched enormous amounts of sulfur dioxide high into the stratosphere, and up there it formed a haze that reflected sunlight back into space before it could reach the ground. The result, according to many researchers, was a volcanic winter. A sudden, sharp drop in global temperatures that may have lasted years, possibly stretching into a longer cold snap of decades. The sun dims, the world gets colder. Plants that depend on warmth and light start to fail, and every creature that depends on those plants, which is every creature, starts to feel it. So let's talk about what this meant for us, for the small, fragile population of Homo sapiens trying to survive at the time. Here is one of the most haunting facts in all of human genetics. When you look at the DNA of everyone alive on Earth today, all 8 billion of us, you find something strange. We are shockingly, almost suspiciously similar to one another. Genetically, human beings have far less diversity than you'd expect for a species spread across the whole planet. 2 chimpanzees living in neighbouring troops in Africa can carry more genetic difference between them than 2 humans living on opposite sides of the world. Sit with that. There is more genetic variety in a single forest of chimps than in the entire human race. Why? The leading explanation is something called a population bottleneck. A bottleneck is exactly what it sounds like. Imagine our whole species as water in a wide bottle, and then that bottle narrows to a tiny neck. Only a little bit gets through. At some point in our deep past, the human population appears to have crashed to a very small number. By some estimates, just a few thousand breeding individuals, possibly as low as a few thousand people total. Everyone alive today may descend from that tiny surviving group. We very nearly winked out. And every human on this planet is, in a sense, a member of the same small, lucky family that squeezed through the neck of the bottle. Now, some researchers have proposed that Toba was the cause of that bottleneck. The timing is tempting. The eruption is around 74,000 years ago, and some genetic estimates for the bottleneck land in a similar window. The story writes itself. The supervolcano blots out the sun, the world freezes, and humanity is reduced to a last few thousand survivors clinging on in Africa. It's dramatic, it's cinematic, and I would be lying to you if I said the science was settled, because it absolutely is not. Here's the honest, more complicated picture, and I think it's actually more interesting than the clean disaster movie. There's a site in South Africa called Pinnacle Point, and there are sites in other parts of Africa where researchers have found Toba ash, the actual glass shards from the eruption, sitting right there in the archaeological layers, so we can look at what human beings were doing before the ash fell and what they were doing after. And what did they find? Continuity. In several of these places, people just kept going. They kept making their tools, kept using the coast, kept living their lives across the ash layer, as if the biggest eruption in 2 million years was an inconvenience, not an apocalypse. In some of these sites, human activity actually seems to intensify after Toba, not collapse. There's a site in India called Jwalapuram in the south of the country, and it sits right in the path of the ashfall. Researchers dug through it and found stone tools below the Toba ash layer and stone tools above it, and the tool-making style is broadly continuous across the boundary. Whoever was living there before the eruption, someone with a similar toolkit was living there after. Now there's fierce debate about who those toolmakers even were. Some argue Homo sapiens, others aren't convinced. But the basic observation is striking. Even close to the disaster, in some places human life did not simply stop. And I want to pause on what a supervolcano actually is, because most people have never heard the word and it deserves your respect. A regular volcano builds a cone and erupts out the top. A supervolcano is different. It's a colossal underground chamber of magma that, when it finally lets go, doesn't build a mountain. It collapses into a crater called a caldera. Toba's caldera is a lake today, roughly 100 kilometres long. You could fit a small country inside the hole this eruption left. And here's the part that should keep you up at night just a little. Supervolcanoes are not extinct. There's one under Yellowstone in the United States right now. These systems erupt on timescales of tens of thousands of years, and Toba is a preview of what that kind of event does to a planet. We got a front row seat 74,000 years ago to the sort of catastrophe that our thin, scattered ancestors had absolutely no way to predict or prepare for. So which is it? Did Toba nearly kill us, or did we shrug it off? The most likely answer is that it depended entirely on where you were standing. If you were living in South Asia, directly under that meters-thick blanket of ash, your world may well have ended. Local populations there could have been devastated. But if you were on the southern coast of Africa, living off shellfish and a stable marine food supply, buffered by the ocean and far from the worst of the ashfall, you may have weathered it. The coast is a pantry that doesn't care much about a bad year on land, and that, some researchers argue, is part of why Africa remained the cradle. Not because Africans were tougher, but because certain refugees, certain coastlines, certain valleys stayed livable when other places didn't. And this reframes the whole bottleneck question. Maybe our low genetic diversity isn't the fingerprint of one single catastrophe on one single day. Maybe it's the sum of our species simply being small and vulnerable for a very long time. For most of our existence, Homo sapiens was not the dominant animal on the planet. We were a scattered, thin population of a few tens of thousands, moving in small bands of 20 or 30, always one bad decade away from disaster. The bottleneck might be less the volcano that almost killed us, and more the permanent narrowness of our early existence. We spent most of our history barely hanging on, but I don't want to let go of Toba entirely, because even if it wasn't the sole cause of the bottleneck, it was still one of the most extreme environmental events any human being has ever lived through. And somewhere out there, real people looked up and saw the sky turn to ash. Think about what that experience must have been. You have no science. You have no word for volcano, no concept of stratospheric sulfur. You just know that the sun has gone strange, the air tastes like grit, the animals are behaving wrong, and a cold you've never felt before is settling into the world. For all you know, existence itself is ending, and you have to keep your children fed anyway. You have to keep moving, keep foraging, keep making decisions, in the middle of what must have felt like the end of everything. That is the deep truth this channel keeps circling back to. Our ancestors were not passive background characters waiting to become us. They were people facing catastrophes we can barely imagine, with nothing but their bodies, their knowledge, and each other. And the reason you exist is that some of them, somewhere, made it through. And notice what got them through, because it's the same thing every single time. Not brute strength, not sharp claws or thick fur. Knowledge and cooperation. The band that knew which shellfish were safe on which tides, which valley stayed green when the sky went grey, how to share a scarce catch so that nobody starved and nobody hoarded. That band survived. Survival in the deep past was almost never a story of one strong individual. It was a story of a group that pooled its knowledge and refused to let its weakest members fall. When the environment turned lethal, the human superpower wasn't muscle. It was memory, communication, and trust. Toba, in a strange way, was a test of exactly the traits that make us human, and the ancestors who passed that test handed those traits down to you. There's a bigger lesson buried in the Toba story too, and it's a slightly uncomfortable one. We tend to think of humanity as unstoppable, as the apex species, as the animal that conquered the earth. But the genetics say otherwise. They say we came within a hair of vanishing. They say the entire sprawling human race, every language, every city, every song ever written, traces back to a population so small it could fit inside a modern sports stadium with room to spare. We are not the inevitable winners of evolution. We are the improbable survivors of it. Everything humans have ever built stands on top of a near miss, and it makes you wonder about all the near misses we didn't survive. How many other human species, how many other small bands, looked up at their own version of the ash sky and didn't make it through? The fossil record is full of dead ends, of relatives who came so close and then were gone. We are the branch that held. Not the only one that deserved to. Just the one that did. I'll leave you with where the science actually stands right now, because I don't want to pretend it's tidier than it is. The extreme version, Toba, single-handedly crushed humanity down to 1,000 survivors on one apocalyptic day, has lost a lot of ground as more sites like Pinnacle Point and Jwalapuram get studied. The bottleneck is real. Pinning it entirely on Toba is what's in doubt. But the eruption itself is not in doubt at all. It happened, it was staggering, and human beings lived through it. Both things can be true. It may not have been the day we almost died, and it was still one of the most extreme things our species has ever endured. So the next time someone tells you humans are the masters of the planet, you can tell them the truth is stranger and more humbling than that. We are the descendants of a few thousand survivors who squeezed through the narrowest part of the bottle on a planet that has tried to erase us more than once and very nearly succeeded 74,000 years ago on an island in Indonesia. All my sources are in the description. The genetics papers, the archaeology from Pinnacle Point, the debate over the bottleneck. Go read them because the argument between the Toba killed us camp and the we shrugged it off camp is still very much alive, and it's a great example of science actually working in real time. And remember, this is your family history. That tiny surviving population is your family. So stay curious, stay humble about how close it all came, and keep digging. See you in the next one. Bye.